Good morning. In this video we're going to look at website design models. So something that's very important when you develop a website is that you plan it properly, because you've got to remember that when you are building a site, what you don't want to happen is you get halfway through building it, you've spent hours and hours and hours on building this thing, and then all of a sudden you realize that you have left something out. Or if you're in a commercial environment, you could potentially run into difficulties with the person that is paying for your site, which is undesirable. And what the idea is that you would generally do is you would design the site and then get it signed off by the person that's paying you, and then there will be no kind of confusion later on. We're not quite at that point yet, but we're going to look at some models that we can use in order to help us design our websites. And something to bear in mind is that when you are designing it, there's so many different screens and sizes of screens, and therefore if your screens can be different sizes, so can your browsers, and it does make it sometimes quite interesting to design sites. Sometimes you'll need to do a range of different designs based on the potential screens that you could be designing for. So for example, mobile screen looks very different to the 23-inch monitor that I'm recording this on, and therefore the website is going to look markedly different. What you'll find is that there's a few Framesets out there, for example Bootstrap, that are designed from the smallest screen upwards. It's designed to be quite flexible in that method, but it is something that you'll need to bear in mind when you are designing your sites. So there's three models that we're going to look at in here. Now that doesn't mean that there aren't others out there. We're going to look at we're going to look at one new one, we're going to look at one extremely old one, and we're going to look at one it's middle-aged, I suppose you could say. And the box model here is by far the most famous of them. Framesets is quite famous for the wrong reasons, and Flexbox is quite a new theory. So the first one is the box model that we're going to look at, and you'll find lots and lots and lots of information out there about the box model. The idea is that the box model will kind of wrap around every element within your screen. You can see that you've got the content in there, and then it's kind of how it's spaced out between that and other elements. So this isn't just one area of content within your screen. It could be multiple different elements that have this applied to within their screen, and the idea is that you don't just have everything kind of jumbled together next to each other within the screen. The numbers on there are highly likely to be pixels rather than actual physical measurements, because ultimately, as I was suggesting in the previous slide, you don't know just how big your screen that you're designing for is going to be. In fact, there might even be percentages in a different design, and you would obviously apply this model when you are designing your website. So you've got the content in there, which is blue, which is the main area of the site. You've got the padding around it, so like I said, you don't want them all kind of next to each other. It looks quite jumbled up and not very clear. Then you've got a border, should you wish, and that can be anything you want really. And then you finally got the margin. So generally, if you think of a margin, it's from the actual side of the page, but actually this is around the side of this actual element. So you'll need to be vaguely familiar with HTML and CSS to be aware of what I'm referring to there. But if you just think of it as, let's say if you have two of these different sections next to each other, then you want some space between them, otherwise it's quite difficult to read for an end user. This is an example. It's actually quite difficult for me to show this because there's no other bits to the site, if that makes sense. So what we've just got is you've got some code here. I don't know if you can see my mouse, I hope so. You've got some code here. So this is what would have been written within probably a style sheet, either at the top of the web page or in an external sheet. You've set a background color, you've set the width, and then you've got your border, padding, and margin. So here is your content. You can't actually see the section here, the padding. You can see the border, which has been set to green, as you can see here, and then you've got the margin. Now I've put a black box around the screen grab so you can actually see where the edge of the screen grab is. That's not within the code here. I've done it as so that you can see that the margin here is actually having an impact. And the idea is that you potentially have this mirrored going down your page, however you wanted it to be laid out. Flexbox is a much more modern modeling system. I believe it came out something like 2017, because you've got to remember that websites these days are being viewed on all sorts of different screens, different browsers, different devices, and so on. I mean, you can even look at your websites through games consoles these days, through browsers on there, which potentially means that you could be looking at the website on a 49 or whatever it is inch TV, which could be quite interesting. And the idea is that it gives you the ability to give scope to alter the width and the height to your designs, which is obviously going to be quite useful, because you could have people viewing on all sorts of different browsers. It will expand the constraint to fill the available space, and it's direction agnostic. And so agnostic in this instance is not remotely referring to God. It is actually referring to the fact that it can be used across different systems, so interoperable we call it. And that is a very fancy word, but if you think of it in terms of, you can use it across different devices, different types of browsers. So you've got Chrome, you've got Firefox, you've got IE. No doubt that within a year or two there'll be others that will come out, rather than blocks. So if you saw the box model on the previous slide, that was very much in blocks, whereas this is designed to be flexible now. When I did a bit of a search for a nice screen grab, there's all sorts of different things out there, and I guess that's this, a show of just how flexible this thing is, and that when you do change stuff on your browser, then your website needs to be able to accommodate it. Otherwise, a little bit rubbish. If you make a website that is only 1028 pixels wide, then if you were to look at it on your 49-inch TV, it's going to look terrible. There's going to be so much white space on there, or either that, or you'll need to zoom in horrendously, and then it will look just as bad. This kind of works in a similar way to Bootstrap. So Bootstrap is laid out in a grid, and will change its properties based on the size of the browser. Obviously, this isn't a Bootstrap video, but it's kind of a nice example. Bootstrap is a nice thing to look at if you are designing or interested in designing sites. It's a framework, and it's available free on the internet. It just requires a search, and you'll need to have a tutorial in order to kind of give you the ins and outs of it, and you need to be reasonably familiar with HTML and CSS in order to use it effectively. But that's going to be similar to all web theories. The last one is Frameset. Now I'm showing you Frameset because it's quite good to know what came before. I sound like I'm in Assassin's Creed when I say that. It's quite good to know how designers maybe used to create their sites, and things like Framesets is a method they used to use, and in the modern era it's highly not recommended. Not to, in fact, you won't. Nobody would hire a designer to create this these days. It's just utter madness. It would be, but it's there, and it's a good thing to kind of compare the modern models against. And there were some advantages when it was first made. So you were able to have lots of different parts to your site that acted independently. So you got to remember that when we had the first version of the web, so HTML4 it was using back then, mid-1990s, we didn't have a lot of the technology that was available now, and therefore you couldn't have lots of different sections of your site acting independently of each other. Whereas these days, obviously, we can. And therefore, if you used frames, you could effectively be loading a number of different web pages within the single web page. That's why I got the word frameception on there. These days, it's just not what you want, because at its most basic level, the end user could well find it confusing, because you've got all these different things loading everywhere, and they don't look like they're working together. You may also find that if you are trying to use one section of the frame set and you do something like hit the back button, then you'll only have that one frame have that applied to. So you'll have like 2/3 of your web page loaded, and then a completely different web page loaded within the frame, which will be interesting. Your search engines will have difficulty indexing them. So in other words, if you put your search into a search engine for a particular topic, the web page, the search engine may have difficulty finding the keywords within it, and therefore it won't display. If you don't have that in your if you're not visible on a search engine, no one's going to visit you, or you're going to find it much more difficult to get visitors coming to your page. That is ultimately something which a lot of people are familiar with these days. I don't have the exact stats, but I'd imagine that generally, if you're on a web page, or if you're looking for a page, then going to the search engine is probably the first thing most people do these days. And so therefore, if you're high up the results, you're going to have more traffic. There is more stuff for Framesets out there, but ultimately, I think it's a case. It's a very old type of modelling, along with the use of something like tables. So tables are still used and can still be useful to hold data. They're not useful for holding for laying out a web page. Frames are just not useful at all. The only time when you might maybe have a frame, so there's a new type of element out there called an iframe, which is what you might use for Google Video, for example, and that allows the user to control video content within it. It can be useful for that, but as a method for laying out a web page, it's to be avoided massively. But it's a good thing for you to be aware that these things exist. This is an example of a frame set page, and you can see the various different elements within it that are in their own frames. So this is only 3. I know a number of them that have more than this, and you can imagine that you might be using one of these. So let's say just this one at the top left hand corner, and then you hit the back button, and this page or this part of the web page will load into a different web page entirely. So this might be, I don't know, BBC Sport, and the rest of your page may be what you want it to be initially. It'll look horrendous and be very confusing for an end user. And also, you've got all of the when I look in this frame up here, I can see that this scroll bar is tiny, and that would suggest that there's a lot of stuff in here. And I would just think, why would someone do that? That doesn't make any sense to me. And the same with this one here. This is clearly a very, very long list. You're likely to confuse your end user. That's a big no-no. You can also tell, quite frankly, that based on the screen grab that I have found this morning, or was it last night? I can't remember. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Based on the screen grab that I have found, this is a very old browser. Okay, there's not many websites out there that use this stuff anymore, and for all the reasons that we've just suggested. So you might struggle, frankly, to find a live site, but you can certainly find screen grabs and some examples out there of where it has been used in the past, and it's something to avoid, in my experience. Okay, well, thank you for listening. I hope to see you soon. Thank you very much. Goodbye.